Okay, good evening. I'm Jim Traub. I'm a teacher here at NYU Abu Dhabi, as well as a journalist with the website foreignpolicy.com, and I'm your host this evening for our guest, Samina Ahmed, who is our latest Peace Fellow. So I just want to say a few words about Samina. She's the South Asia Director for the International Crisis Group. In that job, she has not a very high public profile, but she's an enormously important person in the world of conflict resolution. So let me just say a word or two about the organization. The International Crisis Group describes itself as an independent, nonprofit, non-governmental organization committed to preventing and resolving deadly conflict. What that means is that it's a network of people in 80 conflict zones, but really in the conflict zone, who are analysts who on a regular basis are speaking to the combatants themselves, speaking to government officials, speaking to journalists and other knowledgeable people on the ground, who then write up extremely granular, detailed reports on the situation and also offer highly specific recommendations to the warring parties, to the neighboring countries, and to the United Nations. They also engage in very quiet advocacy in global capitals. I knew of Samina before I knew Samina because I would read the ICG reports on Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is what Samina will be talking about tonight. And they were so brilliantly written, and they were so deeply knowledgeable, and they were so detailed and extraordinary. So in Samina, we have someone who represents the very best of what is one of the very best organizations that we have. So, Samina?
Jim, thank you very much. And I must say it's a great pleasure to speak in this wonderful institution. I've come across in the past couple of days the students here, and it's so obvious the thirst for knowledge and the way they respond is exceptional to challenging their own thoughts and their narratives. But let me start off by saying that my presentation is based on my own personal views, not those of my organization. And as you can see from the title, The Fog of War, quite obviously, the presentation is going to focus far more specifically on what's happening within Afghanistan in the 15th year of a war, but in the past 3 to 4 decades, this is yet another stage of a civil war that's been continuing there. Now, where do we stand if you start looking at the situation within Afghanistan? Right now, it is possibly, and we keep on saying this, it's not the crossroads. There's no crossroad here. It is probably the most crucial period in Afghanistan's recent history. It could go either way. The situation could stabilize. So it is not to say that all is lost. But clearly, the security threats there are now immense. Civilian casualties, the casualties amongst Afghan security forces, the international exit there, and the cross-border dimensions, which takes me to the other side of the border, Pakistan, and the situation there, and how it impinges on stabilization in Afghanistan. To start off with, I think it's important to understand why we see such a spike in violence in insurgent attacks. And there's a clear link to a decision taken by the international forces to withdraw. The Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, ANDSF as they're called, are still a young professional army, a young professional police. There are many gaps, enablers as they're called, in logistics, in intelligence, in hardware. And that's been clearly demonstrated by the fact that while they've fought the insurgents, they're losing territory. The insurgents do have the upper hand. And why Pakistan? Why are we talking about Pakistan? For a simple reason. Because Pakistan's role will be as important as the dynamics that drive Afghanistan's security and politics. For a simple reason, all three major insurgent groups, the Quetta Shura, as it's called, first headed and set up by Mullah Omar, which was then, before the intervention happened, called itself the Islamic Emirate and controlled the country. Hikmet Yar's Hizb-e Islami and the Haqqani Network. They're all, the command and control of all three major insurgent groups is based in Pakistan. So Pakistani policies and preferences towards Afghanistan will have a huge impact on whether Afghanistan stabilizes or descends into chaos. And in Pakistan, policies are determined, like in any other transitional democracy, by a very fragile balance between the civil and the military. There is an elected government, but it ceded control over national security and foreign policy to the military, in particular with regards to the most sensitive subjects, relations with the United States, relations with India, and relations with Afghanistan. So the biggest question here that's asked now is, has the Pakistani military decided to change its policy towards Afghanistan? In Afghan perceptions, the Pakistani military still supports Afghan proxies to promote perceived national security interests. The second question is, can that policy change? Will there be a shift in the civil-military balance? Elections are due in Pakistan. This will be historic for that country's democratic transition in 2018. The civilian government led by Nawaz Sharif actually does have a preference. And that preference is for peace with its neighbors through the broadening of economic ties. That is possibly a far more effective way of reducing mistrust than any other, to the benefit of both countries. But we're in 2016. 2018 is a long way away. Till then, what do we see happening in Afghanistan? And so, quite obviously, a logical starting point is to talk about what is happening on the ground as we speak in Afghanistan. So let me just give you some basic facts and figures. But before I do, a small rider here, which is, yes, the international forces are in a mode of transition, and that transition should actually have been completed by now. At a high of 2011, there were 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan. They're now down to 9,800. NATO, two agreements, crucial agreements that the Afghan government has with its Western partners. One is with NATO, a status of forces agreement, SOFA, and the other is with the bilateral security agreement with the United States. Because of these two agreements, and they're very important, even if the numbers are about 13,000 of foreign troops, it's the signaling that matters. And the signaling is that the international community has handed over responsibility for the security of Afghanistan to its institutions, but will continue to support Afghanistan's stabilization. There's also another signal sent, which is to the insurgents, that the international community isn't running for the exits, that there is a continued commitment to Afghanistan. But that said, the transfer of combat responsibilities countrywide to the Afghan National Security Forces has not proved to be a success story. 2015, in some ways, was a turning point. And according to the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, as of last year and now, the Taliban presence and control of Afghanistan is the widest since the intervention took place 15 years ago. Civilian casualties are also at the highest levels in Afghanistan. In Afghan national security forces, their casualties are at the highest levels. These three things do matter because they shape perceptions. There's no part of the country that is safe, including the most guarded of cities, Kabul. There were any number of suicide attacks last year, but there have been almost on a weekly basis attacks this year as well. There was one yesterday in Kabul. According to the US Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, Sheikh, the security forces in Afghanistan control about 70% of the territory now. 30% is in insurgent hands. According to the Afghan government's data, there have been attacks in 24 of the 34 provinces in Afghanistan. Very recently, one of the most crucial provinces, Helmand, 2 of the districts have been taken over by the Taliban, and there is great concern that possibly Helmand might be the first province to fall into insurgent hands. Why have the Taliban upped the ante? Quite obviously, one of the reasons being the international forces and their exit has encouraged them. They're setting up permanent sanctuaries. That's another reason. The high-profile attacks are also meant to demonstrate strength and resolve and to shape domestic opinion, but also to shape international opinion. That if there is to be a peace, it will be on the insurgents' terms. Now, this is not to say that the insurgents are united or cohesive. The three main groups sometimes are at cross purposes. And even in the main group, which is the Quetta Shura, Mullah Omar's Shura, ever since his death in 2013 was made public in mid-2015, there's been a leadership struggle. Mullah Akhtar Mansoor, who is a self-nominated, appointed successor, hasn't convinced every commander, including his major rival, Mullah Rasul, that he is the legitimate head of the Quetta Shura. I should also add that the Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has pledged allegiance to Mullah Mansoor. I should add that his deputy, the operational commander of the Haqqani network, is now very much a part of the Taliban structure, and the Haqqani network is linked to Al-Qaeda, which creates all kinds of problems when you talk about negotiations with the Taliban. But these internal rifts have led to perhaps one of the driving forces behind this spike in the insurgency, because this new commander has to prove that he's capable of running the Taliban successfully and combating their enemies and proving his strength. So in some ways, I think Mullah Omar's death and the succession struggle has contributed to this resurgent Taliban, the military prowess. A major city, Kunduz, was captured. For the first time, a major city in Afghanistan was captured since the intervention took place for a brief period of time, but even that symbolically was very important. The second thing that matters, the news of Mullah Omar's death and how it was revealed, which takes us to the other side of the border, Pakistan. The news was probably leaked. And of course, there were rumors that he died of illness in a hospital in Karachi, the southernmost port city. And the news was made public just there was a first round in mid-2015 of direct peace talks between Kabul and the Taliban, sponsored by the Pakistanis in Pakistan, in a city called Murree, up in the hills. The second round was to take place, and this news was made public. Now, that tells you something about the extent to which the Afghan security forces, in particular NDS, the main intelligence agency, is opposed to a Pakistani role in guiding these talks or taking the lead in these talks. But the skepticism about Pakistan's role extends beyond just the intelligence agencies. In particular, the spike of attacks that have taken place, the fall of Kunduz, has reinforced suspicions within President Ashraf Ghani's government of Pakistani intentions. Now, if that is where we stand, what do we do in terms of seeing some kind of a process which is sustainable, let alone a process that will lead to the fog of war lifting in Afghanistan? The Pakistanis right now insist that these are misperceptions, and they are truly committed to an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process. The advisor for foreign affairs, Sartaj Aziz, there was very recently a round of US-Pakistan strategic talks, and this is what he had to say, quote unquote. He said, regrettably, there is a tendency to blame Pakistan in somewhat simplistic fashion for most of the difficulties and challenges that engage Afghanistan. Nothing can be further from the truth than to hold Pakistan responsible for Afghanistan's problems. Who would like to see one's neighbor's house on fire with the hope of saving one's backyard? But this doesn't hold much water in Afghanistan, where it's believed that yes, the Pakistani military has taken some steps to oust militants, in particular from the bordering areas, the tribal belt that borders on Afghanistan, in an operation which is called Zarb-e-Azm. But it's strongly believed that as a result of this operation, that the borders were actually opened to allow the Taliban, A, the Taliban were not targeted, and B, foreign fighters as well as the Taliban, Pakistani and Afghan, were allowed to cross the border into Afghanistan. And this has contributed to the most sophisticated attacks that have taken place. And actually, US sources don't disagree with that, because according to US sources, the foreign fighters that are now in Afghanistan that were involved in some of the most egregious acts of violence include the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, as well as the Lashkar-e-Taiba, you might have heard about that, an anti-India Pakistani jihadi organization, as well as the Lashkar-e-Jangvi, which is a Sunni extremist organization responsible for any number of targeted attacks in Pakistani territory as well as in Afghanistan. So is there good reason why the Afghans are suspicious? As I said, if they're cross-border sanctuaries, if the leadership is in Pakistan of all three major insurgent factions, if the Afghans and the international partners are beginning to understand that if these cross-border sanctuaries are not addressed, if the command and control remains in Pakistan, then there is no way that peace is going to be around the corner. And very recently, for the first time in these 15 years, Pakistan has repeatedly denied Taliban leadership. It's across the border, it's in Afghanistan. Same visit. Sartaj Aziz, when he was in DC, also addressed the Council on Foreign Relations. And for the very first time, in the context of this new process, which is called the Quadrilateral Coordination Group, 4 parties are involved in these talks: the United States, China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. This is what he had to say. He said, "We can exercise the influence of the Taliban to bring them into this process of direct talks." He said, within quotes, "Their leadership is in Pakistan, their families are here, we can use those levers to pressure them to say, come to the table." What was the Afghan response to that? I think, first of all, there was anger, denial all these years, and it was obvious to everybody. But this is what the Afghan Deputy Foreign Minister had to say. He said, Pakistan should not just use the leverage and influence it has with the Taliban leaders to join the peace process, but use that leverage against all those elements who are not amenable to peace in Afghanistan. And he added, fix the sanctuaries wherever they are. We need action to convince our people that Pakistan is in earnest. But skepticism is at the highest levels of the Afghan government on these quadrilateral coordination group efforts to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. And this is what President Ghani's special representative for reform and good governance had to say. He said, you know what, these talks, they're a waste of time. The Taliban are preparing militarily for a new, more dangerous fight in the coming year. This is still the Afghan winter going into the spring. One of the reasons why these talks took place was to end the violence. And if that was the objective, that's already failed. The Taliban have actually refused. Very recently, the last round was held, and the Pakistanis said, we have generously offered to host this round of talks in Islamabad. This was the Taliban's response. On the 5th of March, they said, we reject all rumors and state that the leader of the Islamic Emirate has not authorized anybody to participate in these meetings, and they have preconditions. What are their preconditions? Withdrawal of all foreign forces, release of all Taliban prisoners unconditionally. Now, these could be bargaining ploys, and you and I have discussed that. But more problematic is an absolute refusal to accept a ceasefire. Now, if that's the case, and the Taliban keep fighting, how does it affect the legitimacy of the Afghan government and its credibility, its ability to convince the Afghan people that it represents their interests instead of self-survival? I should add that, look, Taliban expansion of influence is not only because of cross-border sanctuaries. There are many other factors driving the ability to gain control of territory, even if it's temporary, gain control of populations, not necessarily at the point of the gun, but willingly. And that is because of any number of problems that we've seen in terms of governance. The state's inability to deliver services is only one of them. Warlordism, some pretty ugly partners that the international community decided would be useful for counterterrorism efforts, which promoted terrorism, unfortunately. So where are we at right now? The security transition is what I've been talking about, but there's a far more important transition, which is the political transition. Unless you get the politics right, you're not going to get the security right, and there's a reason for it. For the last 15 years, the international community, spearheaded by the United States, balanced two objectives in Afghanistan: justice and security. And there was a strong belief, security first and justice later. And the void that was created allowed the Taliban to provide its very brutal form of justice, but a sort of justice. If there's a consensus that needs to be reached, that consensus is absolutely urgent, because if there isn't a consensus within Afghanistan on what needs to be done in terms of desired outcomes of a process, and even the shape and the directions of the peace process with the Taliban, you have a fragile government. It's called a national unity government. It's hanging by a straw right now because so many of the partners that the president has, President Ghani, don't accept either what the Pakistanis are saying or what the president is trying to do. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-regional country. The Taliban are predominantly Pashtun. The leaders that represent the minority communities are fearful that their communities might be sacrificed at the altar of political expediency. So the political stabilization angle, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial. That consensus needs to be built up across the border in Pakistan. There are as many interlocutors who are fearful of a deal which is a quick fix with the Taliban in the interest of even a temporary peace, because of the links between insurgents both sides of the border. The Pakistani Taliban, the Taliban movement of Pakistan, it calls itself. The blowback for Pakistan is already there. You now have Pakistani insurgents that are using Afghan territory to attack Pakistani security forces. And beyond that, there are links between the local jihadi groups, the regional jihadi groups, and the transnational jihadi groups. The latest actor, of course, is the Islamic State, that's making its appearance actually far more dangerously in Pakistan than it is in Afghanistan, but it's making its appearance all the same. So what are the implications if these talks are pushed in a direction which isn't acceptable within Afghanistan? And what are the implications if a deal is reached that allows the opening up of spaces both sides of the border? You know, the United States was initially very hesitant to push for a settlement with the Taliban or even begin a dialogue. But you have a president now who, A, wants to end the war and bring US troops home and have something to show for 15 years of blood and treasure in terms of a political settlement. But when the reluctance was there, the US said there are three preconditions. One, that the Taliban must renounce violence. Two, that they must respect the Afghan constitution. And three, that they must break links with Al-Qaeda. From preconditions, they then became possible outcomes of a process. But there's very little evidence that the Taliban are interested in a process that will lead them to accept any one of these three preconditions at this point in time. I'm going to leave it at that, Jim.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samina. So now you all know what I mean by the granular detail and deep understanding that Samina brings to this subject. So I want to take you back to something you touched on briefly and that you and I have talked about, which is you said that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration made the same mistake of thinking security first and justice next. Now, the United States knows a lot about the security side, right? They have a big military to provide that. They don't know so well how to provide this justice thing. So what would it have meant if they had listened to you way back then and said, okay, justice first, not security first?
2004 is when we took out our first report, saying what's going wrong right now is a stress. First of all, let's be very clear about it. The intervention took place because of 9/11. The objectives were counterterrorism. Target and destroy Al-Qaeda. The Taliban weren't even at that point in time considered to be anything more than a local problem. But when the killing started of foreign soldiers, when there was more of an understanding that there was a link between terror groups and local jihadi groups. What wasn't understood is this wasn't Iraq. I think that was the biggest mistake made. It was an assumption made that we are foreigners, we don't understand the Afghans, but we do know what we need to do, which is get rid of the bad guys. The Afghan people welcomed the Taliban's downfall, and they welcomed the intervention for a reason. There were huge expectations that there would be peace. And by peace, they did not just mean foreign fighters would be ousted. By peace, they also meant the dividends of peace. So in these areas where there was such a demand for justice that had been denied to the Afghan people under the Taliban's brutal rule, American policy was still narrowly focused, not on state building, not on, on understanding what were the demands of the Afghan people, but on preventing the return of Al-Qaeda and foreign terrorists. Had they understood then what the Afghan people wanted, it was a partnership that was so easily forged at that point in time.
And what would that have entailed?
It's quite simple. I'll give you one example, which was the justice sector. Of the billions of dollars the US poured into Afghanistan, 75% was spent on building a huge Afghan national security force in a country that never had a huge military or a huge police and never needed it. The justice sector was completely neglected. It was a weird process in these initial years. It was called the lead nation process. So there were countries in the international coalition that took on the lead role. And the lead role for justice, it's a very bad joke, I shouldn't even be making it, was given to the Italians.
Are you implying that there's some contradiction in terms between Italy and justice?
No, what
No,
I'm implying is that the Italians weren't really all that keen on getting involved in the justice sector. But by the time I think there was an understanding that the lead nation concept didn't work, the justice sector was still neglected. One example, early years, there was a beginning of concern about the growth of narco trafficking. So what to do about it? Interdict. And when we spoke to Afghan officials, spoke to the governor of Kandahar, where it was rampant already, warlordism and criminality, and the Taliban all benefiting from drug trafficking. And the governor said, I don't even want my police to go near these guys. And I said, why? He said, look, two reasons. One, if we manage to arrest a narco trafficker, what do we do? There's no law, no body of law. It was destroyed. It needs to be rebuilt. Fine, even if we use customary justice, which we still have. Where are the courts? Where are the judges? So justice completely was neglected. Now, was it impossible to figure out that when you are in the process of rebuilding a state, you have to go beyond elections? So there was an emphasis. You need to reintroduce or introduce for the first time. And this is where the US got it right as well. Jim, I'm not saying that everything went wrong. Representation means accountability. So elections were held. And the Afghans, for the first time in their history, directly elected their governments. And they were proud of doing it. Unfortunately, electoral reform wasn't great. The electoral system was pretty shoddy, and those elections were stolen. But for somebody who was observing the process, it was amazing that there was so much anger. The lack of justice and the lack of transparency and accountability of their government.
But I want to push you on this a little bit further, because I'm struck by your sense that these are things that, had they been done well, could have been done. So when you think about, I think it's not quite fair to say that the United States was only spending money on guns and elections, because they spent massive amounts of money, for example, on employment schemes, something called the AVP that you would know well. It's basically a scheme to make sure, basically to throw money at key districts that were seen as being threatened by the Taliban. And that money, in turn, grossly distorted the local economy and made it almost impossible to get anybody to do anything but dig canals that may or may not have been necessary, because that's what the money was going to. So the question that leads me to is there something so inevitably distorting about the role of this big, powerful country that is the United States, that lives 8,000 miles away and does not know the local realities, so that whatever they do will be with such a heavy hand that they'll just get it wrong?
No, the problem lay in the fact that the money that was put into reconstruction was shaped by security concerns. There was a concept called the provincial reconstruction teams, the PRTs, a really bad concept. In other words, the military got the money, the military decided to spend it, they dug wells, didn't consult with communities, put it in the wrong projects. I remember the earliest day of the intervention, talking to the US commander. This is before you even had NATO expanding its presence outside Kabul. And hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated for a ring road. And I said, you know what? That's going to be blown up by the insurgents. First chance they get. And it'll make it easier for them to get to places if they don't blow it up. Just think of where you'd go if you were actually consulting, and it was not impossible to do, because as I said, some of the things the US got right are also impressive. The setting up of representative institutions, in particular the Afghan parliament, representatives from to understand Afghanistan, you had to talk to the folks who, you knock on their door, they were like about, a short drive away from, where there were US representatives, civil and military. But because it was such a narrowly defined intervention in security terms, and because assistance was provided by security, through security institutions, for security imperatives, no, it wasn't. The money was wasted.
It could have been done well, and it was done badly.
Very easily done if it, whenever assistance is linked specifically and narrowly to security imperatives, you have problems. So what happened was buying warlords. It wasn't that it distorted the local economies. No, at the local and district levels, it empowered a lot of really bad people who were considered to be allies in the fight against terrorism. And the realization did gradually sink in that this is problematic, the corruption is problematic, throwing money, good money after bad is problematic. But it took a long time for that realization to happen. And in some ways, by then, the Taliban had started encroaching and becoming more aggressive. So you went back from, yes, we can make a difference, to, you know what? It's a bad war. We need to leave.
That certainly is the moral that people have drawn. Not that they did it wrong, but that it can't be done right. But so let's talk about Pakistan for a second. Now there, the United States said, actually prior to Obama, there was this Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill that provided, I think, $6 billion over 5 years or something for development in Pakistan. And the premise of that was, we have got to strengthen the civilian side of Pakistan. That's in their interest, it's in our interest. Well, I think there again, there's a tremendous sense of disappointment and embitterment, because not only does it seem like it was a drop in the bucket and couldn't possibly have much of an effect, it clearly had no effect at all on the popular attitudes towards the United States and Pakistan, where there were moments where the entire relationship almost broke apart. Was that mishandled on the American side, or was it just a kind of hopeless proposition?
I wouldn't say it was at all a hopeless proposition. We did a huge amount of advocacy with Senator Kerry, Senator Lugar, and Representative Berman on, helping to get Congress to understand how important this broadening of a relationship was, going beyond the relationship with the military. But in Pakistan, it wasn't, Jim, any different in some ways, unfortunately. Because again, counterterrorism, interests and priorities were far more important than that very sensible idea of broadening relations with the civilians. Al-Qaeda, or the Pakistani military's actions against other foreign enemies, meant that you still had the highest levels of the US government knocking on the army chief's door, even when there was an elected government. And when we would say to, fairly influential people in Washington that, look, this is not a great signal sent to the Pakistani people.
But my impression was that at least the Obama administration was extremely eager to shore up the legitimacy and effectiveness of the civilian government, because in fact it drove them crazy having to deal only with the military and the intelligence folks when they realized that those guys were playing such a double game with them. But there wasn't very much they could do about it.
I remember Admiral Mullen, Chairman Joint Chiefs, and the discussions that were held on the fact that they're hunting with the hounds, and and you need to be careful.
And
there's a
at the
double
end of
game.
his tenure, he denounced the Pakistani military quite openly.
That's what I mean. It took him the month that he was leaving office to say, the Haqqani network is a veritable arm of Pakistani intelligence. Now, it took him that long to figure it out with the kind of intelligence the US military had.
I assume it took him that long to say it publicly. I assume he knew it all the time.
He knew it all the time, which is exactly what I mean. It was politically expedient to pretend that this double game wasn't being played because there were other priorities with regards to the relationship. That even during the Obama administration, for most of the Obama administration, has taken precedence over that relationship with the civilian leadership or supporting the democratic process. And the reason, again, is because when you have such a very narrow understanding of security dynamics, in the past few years, there's been, constant US pressure on the Pakistanis to take action against the tribal insurgents. When we kept on saying, the problem isn't that little tribal belt. You need to figure this one out, because you can't just say, go after the folks who are operating across the border in Afghanistan. You need to talk about the A to Z of jihad in Pakistan. You need to put as much pressure on them to get after the guys who are crossing the border into India, and that could lead to a conflict that could possibly even escalate to the nuclear level. But the US was picking and choosing, and in some ways, I think part of the problem was Afghanistan. Linking Pakistan and Afghanistan and looking at US policy interests in Pakistan through an Afghan lens. The first priority, get the Pakistani military to work with us against those guys that are killing our boys and girls in Afghanistan, and then we'll think about all the other problems that Pakistan has. And the one thing I was repeatedly told by fairly senior US government officials in the Obama administration, no different from what I was told under the Bush administration, by the way. Well, we talk to the military because they're the guys who are running the show.
Which was true.
Which was true. to which we would say to them, well, understand this is a democratic transition and this is how transitions happen. If you keep on reinforcing the military through your assistance policies, through the diplomatic support that you give the military, you are then undermining the democratic transition in Pakistan. But if you were to actually understand it's in your interest, the only way this country is going to stabilize. It's multi-ethnic, multi-regional. It's a Muslim majority country, one of the very few where, unlike Turkey, for example, in elections, all the Islamist parties combined got 4 to 6% of the popular vote. Is it in your interest to support this transition? And I think there were many in the US administration who did understand it.
I think there are many who threw up their hands. They said, this country is pathological.
Well, this is where the problem lies, this pathological business. If it's pathological, the pathological bit came out of the narrative that was driven by the security agencies. I'll give you one example. Osama bin Laden's killing in Pakistan. Were there riots in the streets of Pakistan against the US? Of course they weren't. But look at what happened. The Pakistani ambassador to the United States was sacked because he said to the US, help us. The military plans to oust this elected government because Osama was found in a city which is basically the largest training ground of the Pakistani
You
Office
assume
of
the
War.
military knew he was there, or important elements of the military knew he was there?
I have no idea if they knew or they didn't know, but the fact remains he was in Abbottabad and the military academy is in Abbottabad, and this is what the civilian government said, help us. But the pathological part, were there riots in the streets? No, there were people saying, this man was in Pakistan? And he was in Abbottabad? What were we doing by giving him sanctuary and support? If we were giving him sanctuary and support, and if we weren't, why didn't we know he was here? So I'd be a little cautious. Do we see anti-American riots unless they're orchestrated? You don't. If you are talking about...
Weren't there anti-American riots in the aftermath of the Raymond Davis episode?
No, they weren't.
This is an American CIA agent who was basically shot and killed somebody when they stopped his car in Islamabad or Lahore? Anyway.
In Lahore, actually. Yeah, they were. No, they weren't.
They weren't, okay.
So every time we've seen these, not bumps in the road, but major crises between Pakistan and the United States, you don't see people enraged. You do see, and there's no doubt about it, the Islamist Party is using this to mobilize support or attempting to mobilize support. You do see the Islamist radicals coming out. But is there any popular support behind them? There isn't.
Yeah.
So I'd be a little cautious going by the images that come on television screens to the reality on the ground.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, one thing I don't think I've ever quite understood is what were those factors that were more politically expedient to allow Pakistan to continue, to basically allow Pakistan, from the US side, to allow Pakistan to continue its activities? What were the factors that the US was getting out of this relationship with Pakistan to allow it to continue, essentially undermining one of its core military campaigns right next door?
Very simple. The primary factor was Al-Qaeda. Because the military regime then, after it was told you're either with us or against us, agreed to support US efforts to oust Al-Qaeda, more than 600 Al-Qaeda operatives and leaders were detained, killed, or extradited from Pakistani territory. And that was, as I said, counterterrorism was the main imperative that drove US policy. Now, the question I would have asked is, what were 600 al-Qaeda operatives and leaders doing on Pakistani territory? Given the fact that, they're dangerous transnational terrorists, and why wasn't action taken against them by Pakistan in its own interests and as a member of the UN, United Nations, their UN Security Council resolutions? But even till today, counterterrorism is a major factor in determining US policy towards Pakistan. So, as I said, the Taliban were considered a local problem, right? Local tribals, they really don't bother us much. Al-Qaeda is our greatest enemy. It's only after the Taliban, or the various factions of the insurgents, started killing American soldiers that there was concern about their activities. And even there, it was of the three major insurgent factions, the Haqqani network that was very closely linked to Al-Qaeda, that concerned the US the most, and to this day, that's a matter of concern. Is that going to go away, that focus on counterterrorism in shaping US policy towards Pakistan? No, it won't. But the main change, perhaps, that's coming about is the realization that the other jihadi groups in Pakistan are as dangerous, not just to the region, but to the international community. Very recently, if you've been following the news, there was an attack that took place in India by an organization which is based in Pakistan called the Jaish-e-Mohammed. A number of Indian soldiers killed at a military base. Earlier than that, there was an attack that took place in India, 2008, Mumbai. And remember one thing, both countries have nuclear weapons. And the United States does not want to see a war between India and Pakistan. So that perhaps is going to be yet another element that's going to play into, still security driven, but I think a little bit more of an understanding now that you can't pick and choose. The Pakistanis should not be picking and choosing. And that, I think, is the strongest message being sent in the last year of the Obama administration to the Pakistani leadership, civil and military. In this latest round of the US-Pakistan strategic dialogue in Washington, D.C. in February, Secretary Kerry made it very, very clear, and he took the names of all these organizations. We agree that with what you say, that you will make no exceptions, and you will go after all violent extremist groups and terror groups. These are the groups we want you to take action against. And he named the anti-India jihadis as much as he did the jihadis that are operating across the border in Afghanistan, the Pakistani jihadis. He did not name the Taliban. He named the Haqqani network, not the Taliban.
Meaning that he doesn't see the Taliban as a danger to the West, to the United States, in the way that he does the other groups.
Meaning that the US wants a dialogue that will lead to some kind of the beginnings of some kind of a political process.
They'll negotiate with the Taliban, but not with these other groups, and nor would there be a reason to, I guess.
With the Haqqanis, the problem now is everywhere. It's a little bit like Admiral Mullen in the last month that he was leaving office saying the Haqqanis are blah, blah, blah. Is if you start connecting the dots, the Haqqanis are linked to Al-Qaeda. The Haqqanis now are a central part of the Taliban leadership, the reconstituted leadership. So if you have a dialogue with the Taliban, you're having a dialogue with Al-Qaeda.
Thank you for the talk. Ahmed Jadoon from Abbottabad, Pakistan. What I want you to talk about is more, if you could explain as to how India-Pakistan rivalry is going to play out in the months or years to come in Afghanistan, because one of the leading reasons as to why Pakistan has supported the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan is because the other group, the Northern Alliance, is very clearly pro-Indian. And then Pakistan to this date is still bitten by Indian support to the Pakistani Taliban, which of course is arguably one of the mess it itself helped create. But how do you think is India-Pakistani rivalry going to play out with all that's going on?
The India-Pakistan rivalry in Afghanistan or elsewhere, it's a self-defeating rivalry on both sides. You know, it's cutting off your nose to spite your face. But that said, India's relationship with Afghanistan predates the Taliban, predates the intervention. It dates back actually to the Cold War years, when the United States had an alliance relationship with Pakistan, CENTO and CETO, and the Soviet Union and India supported Afghanistan. The rivalry was between Afghanistan and Pakistan, not between India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the links that the Afghans have with the Indians, whether they're education, almost all Afghan leaders that in this present government have either studied there, families who live there. What's unfortunate for Pakistan is this, that you actually have a huge number of Afghans who went back after the intervention, after 2001, who lived in Pakistan, who grew up in Pakistan. But because of Pakistani intervention, look at India as a friend and Pakistan as the enemy. So perhaps what Pakistan needs to do is stop thinking about Afghanistan in these zero-sum terms, but more in terms of what are its interests in Afghanistan. You come from a region where it's particularly important that bordering provinces of Afghanistan, Pakistan's, and also where there's a Pashtun population, it is so easy for Pakistan to transcend these notions of rivalries with a country that is quite a distance from Afghanistan, but where it's gained Afghan goodwill for any number of reasons. And reach out to Afghanistan in constructive ways. Perhaps that would be a better course for the Pakistanis to take. And as far as the Indians supporting the Pakistani Taliban, given the fact that the Pakistani Taliban have been attacking Indian installations and embassies and consulates, it's a bit far-fetched.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting talk. I'm Tahir from Lahore. I have a question from looking at the Pakistani perspective, or especially about the Pakistani security establishment perspective. You mentioned there are three major groups, insurgent groups of Afghanistan that are in Pakistan. So looking at the Pakistani establishment perspective, what they intend to gain from them, looking at the point that you made, Pakistan should, or security establishment should not support them or eliminate their sanctuaries. If they do that, will it solve the problem? And secondly, like, what Pakistan security establishment want to get using these sanctuaries or these groups by utilizing them, or what they want, or what's their perspective of peace in Afghanistan? How they want to gain it using these?
Very good question. You know, again, intervention in Afghanistan, there's a history. Didn't happen with the Taliban, happened way before, in the 70s, when the Pakistanis first started backing Afghan dissidents. The dissidents that are actually now a part of the Afghan parliament and the Afghan government, then fighting against their own government. And in some ways, history does matter. The Northwest Frontier Province, I mean, that's the weirdest name there is, right? Or the federally administered tribal areas were used by the British to control Afghanistan. So if there's a myth, and you know, I hope there's an Afghan in the audience who completely contradict me, is that Afghanistan was never colonized. It was by the British who controlled it through proxies. When Pakistan came into being, it assumed this is our sphere of influence, we control it. It's our natural, it's Pakistan's Monroe Doctrine, in other words, our backyard. don't anybody else dare assert their influence over it. And so supporting Afghan proxies over generations with the intent of making sure that you control your backyard, has that policy really changed dramatically? I don't think it has. It's still perceived as Pakistan's backyard. Pakistan still wants to control it, still believes that it has the right to control it. What doesn't help, obviously, and I think that was an earlier question raised, is how it affects the internal dynamics of Afghanistan. So you have actually the Taliban perceived as Pakistani proxies. In fact, the Taliban leader, the guy who's replaced Mullah Omar, by his rival commanders, is already being called Pakistan's, basically a creature of Pakistani military intelligence. So whenever you intervene in the affairs of another country, it's problematic. When you intervene in the affairs of a neighboring country, it's even more problematic. There's one issue that I haven't actually even talked about, which normally when anybody's talking about these issues raises that first, is a disputed border. The Afghans don't accept the international border that divides Pakistan and Afghanistan. So in early years, that was another factor that led to the friction between these two countries. But is that now such a relevant issue? Disputed borders are always problematic. But I think there are many countries that have disputed borders. India and China have a disputed border. Doesn't lead them to war. But intervention, sanctuaries, are problematic. And why is it in Pakistan's interest to continue to provide Afghan insurgent sanctuaries? Doesn't make great policy sense when you see the coming together of the Taliban, both sides of the border. And it's already happened in the eastern provinces of Afghanistan. Kunar is being used by Pakistani Taliban to attack Pakistan. It's increasingly so that even the northern areas, Badakhshan, where you have Pakistani militants who are supported by and work with the Afghan Taliban. So this makes it even more complicated. We're supporting a proxy in Afghanistan that's joined hands with the folks who are killing our security personnel and our citizens. Does it make any sense to continue with that policy? No, it doesn't.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. You mentioned the fact that the so-called Islamic State is gaining traction in Pakistan. Do you have more information or data on where that is? Are these other sort of terrorist groups combining forces and joining Islamic State? Thank you.
There's a certain amount of rebranding that's happening. You know, if you want to hit the headlines, you hit the headlines now, not as the Taliban, nobody's really interested. Not as a local jihadi group in Pakistan. Nobody even knows the names. But you call yourself Islamic State, you get international attention. But there's another reason. That's one reason why the rebranding is happening, to get attention. The second reason is a common ideology. Sunni extremists in Pakistan believe that the Islamic State represents the anti-Shia. Killing Shias is a really good idea, and they've captured territory, and they have resources. So that package is extremely inviting to the extreme anti-Shia organizations in Pakistan. But that's yet another facet. The third facet is money. You have recruiters offering a huge amount of money for foot soldiers. So if you fight the good cause, you get paid for it, and you get international attention. Now, this is still a very, very young phenomenon. It's still a budding phenomenon. The Islamic State will have to compete with so many other jihadi organizations. Let me put it this way. And the turf fights have already started in Afghanistan between the Taliban and Islamic State. So how far can the Islamic State expand its influence or presence, I don't think that it's going to be a major threat, but enough of a threat that it should be taken seriously.